Somewhere in a museum basement, sealed in climate-controlled storage, there is a piece of baked clay the size of your palm. It's covered in tiny wedge-shaped marks pressed into the surface thousands of years ago by someone who woke up one morning, picked up a reed, and decided to write something down. We don't know their name. We don't know what they looked like. We don't even know exactly what the text says because parts of it are broken off, and some of the symbols haven't been fully agreed upon by scholars who have been studying them for decades. But here's the part that keeps certain people awake at night, the part that keeps archaeologists and linguists staring at photographs of clay until their coffee goes cold. The text itself seems to be describing a world that existed before the world the writer lived in, a time before their time, a history before their history. And that's where this gets interesting. We tend to think of ancient writing as ancient, but some of the oldest surviving texts point even further back, to kings who supposedly ruled for thousands of years, to floods that reset everything, to a civilization the writers themselves called primordial. They weren't just recording their present, they were trying to reach backward into something they could barely see, something they'd inherited as memory or myth or oral tradition, and press it into clay before it disappeared completely. Whether what they wrote describes real events or constructed mythology or something in between is exactly the question that no one has fully answered. And part of the reason no one has answered it is that we still can't read all of it. That's what this is about tonight. Not a single secret book. Not one untranslatable document locked away somewhere. The truth is both more complicated and more quietly astonishing than that. The oldest writing on Earth survives in fragments. Thousands of tablets, many of them cracked, many of them missing entire sections, many of them written in a form of script so early that the symbols shifted in meaning over centuries, so that what a sign meant in 3200 BCE means something slightly different a few hundred years later, which means scholars aren't always sure which version they're reading. Add to that the problem of lost context, the fact that ancient scribes assume their readers already knew things we no longer know, and you have a situation where even a perfectly preserved tablet can leave researchers genuinely uncertain about what it's actually saying. So when you hear the phrase, "no one can finish translating it," that's what it means. Not a single unsolvable mystery. 1,000 small ones stacked on top of each other, stretching back across 5,000 years of broken clay and faded ink and languages that died without leaving enough behind to fully resurrect them. It's less like cracking a code and more like trying to reconstruct a library after a flood, using only the pages that didn't dissolve, written in a language that only partially survives, in a handwriting style that changed over time, for an audience that no longer exists. If you're listening to this to wind down, to let something thoughtful carry you towards sleep, then this is exactly the kind of investigation that was made for nights like this one. We're not going to be dramatic about it. We're going to be careful. Because this subject deserves care. The people who pressed these marks into clay were doing something remarkable. They were trying to hold on to things. Names, numbers, stories, the memory of kings who ruled before the flood. They weren't that different from us in that impulse. They just had less certainty about where the past actually ended. Now, here's something worth knowing before we go further. The earliest writing, and we'll get into exactly what that means in just a moment, is mostly practical. Ration lists, livestock counts, who owes what to the temple storehouse. It's administrative. It's accounting. Which surprises people, because we tend to imagine that the first thing humans would write down would be something profound, a poem, a prayer, the name of a god. And eventually, yes, those came. But the very first surviving marks are closer to a receipt than a revelation. And yet, layered in among the accounting, embedded in the later texts that grew from the same tradition, are these strange claims about a world that preceded the writers by what the texts themselves describe as tens of thousands of years. Kings who reigned for 36,000 years. Cities that existed before a great flood remade the earth. instructions and knowledge that supposedly came from a time so distant it had no human equivalent. Whether those are literal records or mythological framing or something more complex is a question scholarship is still working through, and we'll work through it together tonight, calmly, one layer at a time. Before we go further though, I want to ask you something. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is where you're listening, leave a comment and tell me. Just drop your city and the hour. I ask because every time I look at the comments on these videos, it's like watching a map of the world light up in the dark. It's someone in Reykjavik at 2 a.m, someone in Melbourne at breakfast, someone in Sao Paulo who can't sleep, and something about that feels exactly right. For a video about old messages sent across enormous distances of time, we're all receiving them from different places, at different hours, with different pieces of the picture in front of us. That's what reading ancient writing is like too. Everyone working from where they are with what they have, trying to hear something that was sent a very long time ago. So settle in. Let's start at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as the clay will let us get. Before we can talk about what the oldest writing says, we need to agree on what writing actually is, and that turns out to be a harder question than it sounds. There are marks on cave walls in France and Spain that are 40,000 years old. There are carved notches on bones from Central Africa that go back even further, some of them possibly 70 or 80,000 years, arranged in patterns that suggest someone was tracking something, lunar cycles maybe, or hunting seasons. There are geometric signs pressed into clay and ochre from sites across the ancient world that are too deliberate to be accidental and too consistent to be random. These are remarkable things. They are evidence of minds that noticed patterns and wanted to preserve them, but most specialists in the history of writing would not call them writing. Not quite. And the distinction matters because it changes the entire story of when humanity first started sending messages across time. What separates writing from symbolic marking is a specific kind of encoding. Writing doesn't just mean something to the person who made it. It's a system. A sign corresponds to a sound, or a word, or a concept in a way that another person who has learned the system can decode, independently, reliably, without the original maker present to explain it. That's the threshold. Not decoration, not even communication in the broad sense. Systematic phonetic or semantic encoding that a trained reader can unpack. When you cross that line, you have writing. Before it, you have something fascinating, but something different. By that definition, the oldest confirmed writing on Earth comes from southern Mesopotamia, from the region that would eventually become Sumer, and it dates to somewhere around 3,200 to 3,400 BCE. The earliest examples are small clay tablets, pressed with a stylus, covered in marks that would eventually develop into the script we call cuneiform. These are the things scholars point to when someone asks when writing began. Not because there's nothing older that might be writing, but because these tablets are the oldest examples where we can actually demonstrate systematic encoding, where we can show that the signs correspond to agreed-upon meanings in a recoverable way. But here's where the honest answer gets complicated. Dating the oldest writing isn't as simple as finding the oldest tablet and measuring it. Excavation is a slow and imperfect science. A site might have been partially looted before professional archaeologists arrived. Tablets get displaced from their original layers. Carbon dating works on organic materials, but clay is not organic. Scholars often have to date tablets based on the layer of soil they were found in, or by comparing the style of the signs to other dated examples, or by cross-referencing with artifacts found nearby. All of which means there's a margin of error built into every date you'll see attached to early writing. When someone says a tablet is from 3,200 BCE, they usually mean it's from roughly that period, give or take a century or two, with confidence based on converging lines of evidence, rather than a single clean measurement. This also means the title of oldest writing can shift. New excavations happen. Old collections get re-examined. A batch of tablets in storage somewhere gets properly studied for the first time, and suddenly the timeline nudges back a little. Egyptian hieroglyphics, for example, were once thought to clearly postdate Mesopotamian writing, but discoveries in Abydos in the 1990s pushed the earliest Egyptian examples back to somewhere around 3200 BCE as well. Close enough that some researchers now argue they developed independently, rather than one borrowing from the other. There are also disputed candidates. Marks from the Indus Valley Civilization, a still undeciphered script that flourished roughly 2,000 years after the earliest Mesopotamian tablets. Proto-writing from the ancient cultures of the Danube region in Europe, which some researchers call the earliest writing in the world, and others categorize as symbolic marking that never made the full transition into systematic encoding. The honest answer is that the boundary is genuinely contested in some cases, and where scholars draw the line depends partly on how strictly they define the term. What makes the Mesopotamian tablets the clearest candidates is that we can trace continuity. The early marks connect, across centuries, to a fully developed script with known phonetic values and grammatical structure. We can watch the system evolve. That evolutionary chain is part of what makes the evidence convincing. You're not just looking at old marks and wondering. You're watching a technology develop in slow motion across generations of scribes. Now, there's something important about what those earliest tablets actually contain, because it tends to disappoint people at first. They are not epic poetry. They are not religious hymns. They are not letters from one ancient mind to another, pouring out philosophy or grief or love. The earliest surviving Mesopotamian texts are, almost without exception, administrative documents. A list of barley rations, a record of how many goats belong to a particular temple estate, an accounting of labour days owed by workers in a specific city quarter, receipts, ledgers, the ancient equivalent of a spreadsheet. This surprises people. We imagine that the first thing worth writing down would be something grand. But think about what actually drives the invention of a technology. It's usually a problem that needs solving, and the problem that prompted the earliest Mesopotamian writing wasn't a desire for artistic expression. It was the challenge of running a large, complex economy without reliable human memory. The temple storehouses of early Uruk were receiving grain and animals and finished goods from hundreds of different sources and distributing them to thousands of different recipients. Human memory isn't built for that kind of accounting at scale. Writing was invented, as best we can tell, to solve an administrative problem, to track things, to make the impermanence of memory into something fixed and checkable and arguable. That's where things start mundane, practical, almost aggressively unromantic. And yet, here is the quiet tension at the heart of everything we'll be exploring tonight. The same scribal tradition that produced those ration lists, that developed and refined and passed on this technology across generations, eventually produced something else entirely. Texts that reach backward, lists of kings said to have ruled before a catastrophic flood, with reigns measured not in years but in thousands of years. Descriptions of a primordial civilization so ancient that the scribes who wrote about it seemed to understand they were recording something beyond the edge of memory, something inherited rather than witnessed. Instructions for rituals and knowledge that the texts themselves describe as having survived from an earlier world. Whether those later texts are mythology dressed as history, or history dressed as mythology, or something that doesn't fit neatly into either category, is exactly the question that keeps the lights on in certain corners of academia. But the thread runs unbroken from the first scratched ledger to the strangest claims about a world before history. It all comes from the same tradition, the same clay, the same schools of scribes learning the same marks, generation after generation, preserving things they couldn't fully verify but couldn't bring themselves to lose. The record starts with counting, and it ends, or fails to end, at the edge of something much older than counting. Let's follow it there. To follow that thread, we have to go to a particular place, at a particular moment, when the world was just barely starting to look like something we would recognize as a city. Southern Mesopotamia, late 4th millennium BCE. The place the tablets come from is called Uruk. By then, it was already old. People had been living at that spot for thousands of years. But around 3,500 to 3,300 BCE, something changed. The settlement swelled. What had been a town became, by the standards of the time, a superorganism. Imagine a low, flat landscape cut by slow rivers, the Euphrates meandering and splitting, marshes spreading out in wide, shimmering sheets. On one slightly higher patch of ground, mud brick walls grew. Inside them, houses pressed together, courtyards shared walls with workshops, alleys wound between them like veins. At the centre, rising above the rest, were temples. Not isolated little shrines, but sprawling complexes with multiple courtyards, storerooms, workshops, kitchens, and what we would now call offices. These temples weren't just religious buildings, they were economic engines. Land belonged to them. Fields were worked in their name, herds grazed under their oversight. Looms clacked away, weaving cloth that went out as offerings, wages, and trade goods. Grain flowed in after harvest from farmers who owed a share. Grain flowed out again as rations to workers who spent their days digging irrigation canals, baking bricks, or tending flocks. Once you have a few hundred people doing this, memory and a few pebbles in a pouch might be enough to keep track. Once you have thousands, it isn't. The priests and administrators of Uruk found themselves managing something new under the sun. A scaled-up, organised labour force, moving food and goods in and out of central storehouses every single day. And that created pressure. Pressure not in the moral sense, but in the practical one. Who brought in this barley? Who's allowed to take it out? How many jars of oil did we issue to the team repairing the temple roof last month? When you're responsible for redistributing the livelihood of an entire city, I think it was around 10, stops being good enough. That's the environment in which the first tablets appear. The material is as simple as it gets. Clay. The same river mud that people have been treading into bricks for generations. A scribe would scoop up a lump, knead it to the right consistency, and thumb it into a small rectangle or oval that fit nicely in the palm of the hand. While it was still moist, they would press into it with a stylus. At this early stage, the stylus was often a pointed reed, cut from the marsh. Later, it would be trimmed to a wedge shape that gives cuneiform its name, but in the very first tablets the lines are more free form. The scribe didn't carve, they impressed, pushing the tip in at different angles and depths to make tiny pictures and abstract marks. When the surface was filled, the tablet could be left to dry in the air. Most administrative texts probably weren't meant to last forever. They were working documents. Some of them may have been kept in baskets or jars for a season or a year and then recycled. Others, especially contracts or particularly important accounts, could be deliberately fired, either in a kiln or by placing them near a hearth, turning the fragile clay into something ceramic and surprisingly durable. Sometimes a tablet was sealed. A roll or stamp seal, often carved with miniature scenes of gods, animals, and people, would be pressed across the surface or onto a lump of clay that joined tablet and envelope together. The impression was a kind of signature and a security measure. If the seal was broken, someone had tampered with the record, and this is one of the reasons these texts reach us at all. Papyrus rots, leather decays, ink fades. Clay, once baked, does not care. It can sit in a collapsed storeroom, under a metre of mud brick debris, soaked and dried again by groundwater for 5,000 years, and still hold legible marks. The script that began as a way to keep baskets and jars in order accidentally chose as its medium one of the most durable writing supports humans have ever used. On those first tablets, the marks themselves look nothing like the tight forests of wedges that would fill later cuneiform documents. Scholars call this earliest phase proto-cuneiform. The signs are more pictographic. A head of barley really does look a little like a stalk of grain. A jar is a container shape with a line for a neck. A sheep is a simplified animal. But even from the beginning, this isn't freehand drawing. It's a system. The same sign recurs with the same general shape across many tablets from the same period and city. The layout is standardized. Columns, rows, headings. The grammar, if we can call it that, is limited and mostly implicit. You're seeing sequences like number sign, commodity sign, maybe a personal or place name, sometimes a verb-like sign that seems to mean issued or received. There are no flowing sentences, no explicit tenses, no little grammatical particles to tell you this happened yesterday versus this should happen tomorrow. The script is heavily noun-based: person, thing, quantity, location. The relationships between those nouns are partly encoded and partly assumed from context. Reconstructing that system has been a long, careful kind of detective work. Later cuneiform from centuries after these first tablets is much better understood. It has phonetic values. It can spell out the sounds of spoken Sumerian and Akkadian. Scribes in those later periods also compiled sign lists, ordered, almost dictionary-like tablets where they wrote a sign, glossed it with its name, gave variants, sometimes translated it into another language. Those sign lists are lifelines. They let modern researchers look at a simple pictographic mark on a proto-cuneiform tablet and say, with some confidence, this is the ancestor of the sign that later meant barley, whose Sumerian reading we know. The continuity across centuries anchors the guess. Context helps as well. Many proto-cuneiform tablets are clearly administrative. They come from temple or public building levels. They were found in batches, sometimes stacked or dumped together, in rooms that also contained storage jars, ceilings, ration tokens, and other traces of economic activity. When you see a repeated combination of marks on a tablet that was lying next to a pile of animal bones, and the same combination on a tablet near a storeroom full of wool, patterns emerge. This sign cluster is probably sheep. This one might be wool fleece. This number system here is almost certainly counting days, or workers, or liters. Parallels between sites matter too. If a sign appears in Uruk, and the same sign, with the same position in the layout, turns up at another city in roughly the same period, associated with similar artifacts, that's another small piece in the puzzle. Bit by bit, a hazy web of meaning sharpens, but there are limits. The script is early. Its creators weren't trying to give us glosses or explanations. They assumed that anyone reading the tablet was already a participant in the system. Their system of work teams, their system of measures, their calendar. We can often see that an entry records 20-something given to person X, on occasion Y. We can read the numbers. We can identify the commodity. We can sometimes sound out the personal name. What's missing, very often, is the why. Was this delivery routine or a special bonus? Is the person receiving goods a temple worker, a visiting merchant, or a captured foreigner being fed on the state's dime? Is a sudden spike in barley going to certain individuals evidence of a festival, a tax remission, or an emergency distribution after a bad harvest? The tablets don't say. They didn't need to, for their original users. That's the strange, quiet mystery of these first pages of human writing. On one level, we can read them almost fluently in terms of numbers and things. We can say, here are rations of bread and beer for labourers building the temple terrace. Here are animals entering and leaving the herd. Here is wool distributed to women at looms. On another level, we're still guessing at the policies and stories behind those movements. The logic that made someone decide this person gets this much on this day is almost always invisible. And yet, that invisible logic is where the human part lives. Hierarchy, obligation, generosity, resentment, power. The first tablets show us the bones of an organized world, but not the feelings or justifications that animated it. Over time, scribes in places like Uruk would start pushing against that constraint. They would bend this accounting system into something more expressive, letting signs stand not only for things but for sounds and ideas. When they did, the clay that had once just counted goats began to tell stories about gods and kings who lived in ages that even they considered impossibly remote. But to see how a set of grain ledgers turned into a tool for remembering a world before history, we need to look more closely at what those early tablets actually recorded and how they learned to count before they learned to speak. Before the tablets, there were pebbles. Archaeologists call them tokens, little lumps of clay or stone shaped into simple forms, cones, spheres, discs, tetrahedrons, miniature loaves, tiny pyramids. They start showing up in the archaeological record long before Uruk swells into a city. Some scholars would take them back 8,000 or 9,000 years into the Neolithic villages where people were first learning to live with crops and herds. On their own, they look almost like children's toys, but they don't turn up randomly. They're found in houses that show signs of surplus storage, in contexts linked to grain bins, jars, and animal pens. One plausible reading, carefully argued by researchers like Denise Schmant-Besserat, is that each shape stood for a particular kind of thing and a particular quantity. One cone equals 1 measure of grain. One sphere equals 10 measures. A little clay bull's head equals a cow. If that's right, then someone, somewhere in those early farming communities, had already done something quietly revolutionary. They had taken the messy, continuous flow of life, ears of barley, baskets, days of labour, and snapped it into distinct countable units. They had said, this much and no more, and made a token to stand for it. Over centuries, the token system seems to have become more elaborate, more shapes, more implied categories. Sometimes tokens were gathered in small containers, sometimes they were strung, and then, at some point, people began putting them inside hollow clay envelopes called bullae. A bulla is a clay shell, about the size of a fist or a small orange. While the clay was still soft, tokens were placed inside. Then the opening was sealed and the outside was rolled with seal impressions. If you broke the bulla, you could retrieve and count the tokens within. If you left it intact, the sealings on the outside told you whose transaction this was, whose authority stood behind the numbers. Bullae look, to many scholars, like contracts. A sealed, tamper-evident packet certifying that at some moment in the past, someone acknowledged that so many sheep, or measures of barley, or jars of oil, were owed or had been received. A portable promise turned into clay. Now, not everyone agrees on the details. Some think tokens were more like generic counters than fixed symbols. Others question how closely the token system connects to what happens next. But there is a striking pattern. As we get closer in time to the Uruk tablets, we start to find bullae that have marks on their outer surface, little impressions for each token inside. In a sense, they are clay envelopes that carry on their skin a summary of their contents. And then, in late 4th millennium Uruk, someone makes the last, almost obvious step. If you can press on the outside of an envelope to record what's inside, do you really need to put the tokens in there at all? Why not skip the 3-dimensional counters and just work with the marks? Flatten the envelope, keep the impressions. You have a tablet. Whether it was as linear and tidy as that is still debated. Many of the specific correspondences that were once proposed, this token shape equals this early sign, have turned out to be less clear-cut under closer scrutiny. Some sites with tokens never produce tablets, and vice versa. The rise of true writing probably braided together several streams of practice. Tokens and bully, yes, but also tally sticks, notched bones, and the long habit of keeping counts in one's head and voice. Even so, tokens and bully give us a glimpse of what lay behind the tablets, a world that had already been thinking in numbers for a very long time, and those numbers were not simple. In modern life, we mostly live under one counting system. 10 fingers, base 10, one set of units for most things. The people of late Uruk did not. The earliest tablets show an almost bewildering variety of numeric notations and metrological systems. To us, it's as if they were switching between different languages of quantity depending on what they were counting. Grain, for instance, had its own structure. You didn't just write 37 and then a barley sign. You chose from a set of grain numbers, units that scaled up in particular ways, reflecting how barley was stored in jars, how fields were measured, how rations were issued. Animals used another system. A flock wasn't tallied with the same numerals as pots of beer. Days of labour, lengths of land, capacities of containers, each could invoke a slightly different numeric script. To the scribes, this wasn't confusing. It was intuitive, because it mirrored their physical reality. Barley came in heaps and bins, beer came in jars, wool came in bales, and work came in days or shifts. Their metrology, their art of measuring, encoded that. Numbers, units, and objects fused into tight little packages of meaning. A single sign cluster could imply at once how much, of what, and in what form. This is one of the ways accounting shaped writing at its birth. The tablets don't just list things, they classify them. Different sign forms for different commodities, abbreviated marks for common categories, layout conventions that separate headings from entries, totals from subtotals. Over time, certain signs become standard abbreviations, shortcuts any trained scribe would recognize on sight. Standardization is power. Once a temple can say, "This is the official sign for barley," and use it the same way across dozens of tablets, it can compare records across time and space. It can notice shortages, surpluses, discrepancies. It can coordinate multiple work crews, multiple storehouses, multiple estates, because everyone working with the clay is speaking the same narrow technical dialect of signs and numbers. In that sense, the first written world we can actually touch is not primarily a world of voices and memories. It's a world of systems, a world where barley, beer, wool and labour are pulled into grids and columns, turned into entries that can be added, subtracted, audited. From our perspective, that can feel strangely alien. We long for early myths, for origin stories, for the inner lives of the people behind the clay. What we get at first are ration lists, work rosters, inventories of offerings, numerical systems so fine-grained that they tell us, with unnerving precision, how many litres of barley mash one worker in one team received on one particular day, and almost nothing about what anyone thought about it. Yet inside those cold structures is the shadow of something older. The token systems, the bully, the specialized metrologies, all of them suggest that long before anyone scratched a god's name into clay, communities were already organizing their existence through abstract categories and shared conventions. They were building invisible frameworks of obligation and exchange and using numbers to hold them in place. When writing finally begins to record words as well as things, it does so on top of this already built scaffolding. The first stories we can glimpse are written in a script that grew up serving accounts. The language of myth and lore is layered over the language of grain and labour. To see how that layering happened, how pictures for barley and sheep and worker were pushed into service to spell out sounds, we have to follow the scribes of Uruk a little further, into the moment when their numeric administrative clay quietly learns to speak. When the clay first learns to speak, it does so in a language no one alive can hear. Those earliest proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk are mostly silent to us in one crucial way. They're covered in signs, yes. You can count totals, trace deliveries, see that barley went from this institution to that work group. But the signs are still largely pictographic and schematic. They stand for things and categories, not yet for the full sounds of words. Over the next few centuries, the script changes shape, literally. Instead of drawing little pictures with a pointed reed, scribes start turning the stylus and pressing its wedge-shaped tip into the clay. Once you rotate a sign 90 degrees and reduce it to a pattern of angled wedges, it stops looking much like a picture. A fish is no longer a fish, it's a cluster of strokes. A head, a jar, an ear of grain. They all become variations of the same basic impression. That shift toward wedge shapes is part practical, part conceptual. Clay tablets dry. Lines can flake or blur. Wedges, on the other hand, are durable. They resist smearing. They can be repeated quickly and consistently. A trained scribe can dash off lines of signs much faster with presses than with drawings. But there's a deeper consequence. Once you have a limited toolkit of wedge impressions, you can recombine them almost endlessly. Signs multiply, split, and merge. Some keep their old meaning, others drift. New values get attached. A sign that once showed a jar of beer can also stand for the syllable Ka, because in the spoken language the word for jar happens to start like that. A sign for barley might double as a syllable used in the word for abundance. This is where writing becomes more flexible. It's no longer tied only to visible objects. It can capture names, verbs, grammatical endings, even words for ideas that don't have a neat picture. Justice, oath, curse, favour. The script that began as a way to count sheep learns to write about kings, gods, battles, and dreams. From the inside, this evolution is gradual. Generations of scribes copy and recopy, add and refine. From the outside, from our perspective, thousands of years later, it creates a problem. By the time modern scholars encounter cuneiform, they're not looking at neat pictograms with obvious meanings. They're facing dense fields of wedges that can stand sometimes for an object, sometimes for a sound, sometimes for both at once, and sometimes for several different sounds, depending on context, period, and language. Because the script outlives the language it was born into. The earliest tablets almost certainly record a language we call Sumerian. But as centuries pass, other peoples in Mesopotamia start using the script. Akkadian speakers, whose language is Semitic, very unlike Sumerian, adopt cuneiform and twist it to fit their own phonology. Later, Elamites, Hittites, Hurrians, and others do the same. The signs stay roughly similar on the surface. Underneath, the sounds they're attached to change. When European and Middle Eastern travellers first see cuneiform in the early modern period, they have no living informants to ask. There is no continuous reading tradition. The last native cuneiform scribes, working in late Babylonian and Assyrian times, died almost 2,000 years before. The languages once written in the script are either extinct, like Sumerian, or preserved only in later alphabets, stripped of their wedge-shaped clothing. So how do you teach clay to speak again when the speakers are gone? Decipherment, when it finally comes, doesn't start with Sumerian. It starts higher up the time ladder, with one particular cliff in western Iran. On a rock face at Behistun, King Darius of Persia had a proclamation carved around 520 BCE in 3 versions: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, a variety of Akkadian. All 3 texts use cuneiform signs, but they encode different languages. The Old Persian section, crucially, is comparatively simple. It has a small sign inventory and is partly alphabetic, and the names and titles it contains: Darius, Great King; Persia, already known from Greek accounts. 19th century scholars like Georg Friedrich Grotefend and later Henry Rawlinson used those repeating royal names and titles as anchor points. If a cluster of wedges appears every time the Greek text says Darius, it's probably Daryavash in Old Persian. Once a few names are nailed down, other words fall into place. Patterns emerge. A sign that shows up in king, kingdom, and kings probably has something to do with that core idea or sound. This is one of the quiet secrets of decipherment. It relies on repetition and context, fixed formulas, stock phrases, sequences that show up again and again. From Old Persian at Behistun, scholars could work sideways into the other two versions. The Babylonian text looked more complex with hundreds of signs instead of a few dozen, but some passages clearly corresponded line by line to the Old Persian. Where Old Persian spelled out Darius, King of Kings, Babylonian used a cluster that must in some way say the same, with patience, comparison, and a growing recognition that Akkadian belonged to the Semitic family, related to Hebrew and Arabic. Researchers began to hear its grammar and vocabulary. Once Akkadian became readable, the ancient libraries of Assyria and Babylonia were no longer opaque. Vast collections of tablets, letters, contracts, astronomical texts, omens, hymns, epic poetry could be approached. Among them were bilingual and even trilingual tablets, Sumerian on one line, Akkadian glosses or translations on another, school texts where a sign is followed by its pronunciation, lexical lists where Sumerian words are matched with Akkadian equivalents. Those tablets are the Mesopotamian equivalent of a Rosetta Stone. Not one inscription, but a whole genre of didactic material, created by scribes for their own training, that unintentionally became our guide. Using Akkadian as a bridge, scholars could begin reconstructing Sumerian. They could see that a certain cluster of signs, glossed with an Akkadian word for king, probably represented the Sumerian term for king. Lists of professions, animals, plants, and gods quietly mapped out Sumerian vocabulary. Over decades, then generations, patterns of sound and grammar emerged. From the outside, it can sound as if there was a moment when cuneiform was deciphered, and everything suddenly became clear. That's not how it feels up close. Even today, when you hear that cuneiform is a deciphered script, it simply means that we understand its basic sign system and can read many of the languages written with it. It does not mean that every tablet has yielded up its meaning. There are practical obstacles. Most tablets come to us broken, water-damaged, or eroded. A contract might be missing every total. A hymn might lack its refrain. An administrative record might preserve only the headings and lose all the numbers. You can read individual signs and still not know what the original text said. There are linguistic obstacles. Sumerian is unlike any living language. Its structure is still debated in places. Akkadian has dialects spread over many centuries, full of technical terms. Scribal shorthand, rare words, and regional spellings can turn a line into a puzzle even for experts. And then there is the scale of the material. Tens of thousands of tablets sit published in hand copies or photographs. Many more remain in museum drawers, only briefly catalogued. Each genre, legal, medical, astronomical, literary, has its own dense jargon. A phrase that makes perfect sense in a Liver-Omen series can be unintelligible in an agricultural manual, even if the same signs are used. In that sense, the story of how cuneiform became readable is still unfolding. The wedge shapes have given back much of their voice, but not all of it. Each new join between fragments, each newly read personal name or technical term, closes one gap and reveals another, and this slow, uneven readability is part of why some of the oldest clay in the world, especially the tablets brushing against memories of a world before the floods and the kings, still resists us. The script is deciphered. The languages are in broad strokes known. but the meanings in many places remain partial, caught between lost words, specialized vocabularies, and the simple fact that time has broken the clay. To see how that partial understanding plays out when we try to read the very first language written in cuneiform, we have to turn back to Sumerian itself, and to the deeper problem of what it means to understand a world that's been gone for 5,000 years. Sumerian, as far as we can tell, is alone. When linguists call it a language isolate, they mean that after more than a century of comparison, it still can't be securely linked to any known language family. It isn't Semitic like Akkadian. It isn't Indo-European like Hittite. It isn't clearly related to Elamite or Hurrian or anything else we can hear today. That isolation is not just a label. It has consequences. When you decipher a language that has living relatives, you get a safety net. With Akkadian, once scholars realized it was Semitic, they could lean on Hebrew and Arabic. Unknown words could sometimes be guessed from related roots. Weird bits of grammar could be checked against cousins. With Sumerian, there is no cousin. There is no modern speaker. We have only what the clay gives us, and what later scribes chose to copy. So, our understanding of Sumerian is built from three fragile pillars. The first is those bilingual and lexical tablets, where Sumerian words are matched to Akkadian. The second is internal patterns, how signs combine, how sentences seem to be structured, what endings repeat in similar contexts. The third is genre, knowing that a given tablet is a hymn, or a lawsuit, or a school exercise, and letting that expectation guide interpretation. All three are powerful. All three are also limited, because for much of its written life, Sumerian wasn't a day-to-day spoken language anymore. By the time Assyrian and Babylonian scholars are compiling their great lexical lists, Sumerian is already ancient to them. It's a language of ritual, scholarship and prestige, preserved in temples and scribal schools. That brings us to the scribes themselves. If you were a student in a Mesopotamian tablet house, you didn't start with epic poetry. You started with lists of signs, lists of words, lists of professions, cities, metals, trees, birds, fish, gods. One tablet at a time, you'd copy a column of Sumerian entries, then the Akkadian equivalents, over and over, until the wedges came quickly under your hand and the pairings lodged in your memory. These lexical lists could be incredibly detailed. They might tell you that a certain Sumerian sign has 3 different readings, each glossed with a different Akkadian word depending on context. They might group related terms together, varieties of barley, grades of beer, ranks of officials, implying semantic fields that we can only glimpse. Beyond the lists were model contracts, royal inscriptions, hymns, laments. Students copied older texts line by line, sometimes modernizing spellings, sometimes introducing mistakes, sometimes preserving archaic forms they no longer fully understood. From our perspective, this is both a blessing and a problem. It's a blessing because those exercises multiplied the number of copies. A single royal inscription might survive only because generations of students used it as practice material. A rare word might be saved because it appears in a didactic list with a gloss. It's a problem because what we see is already filtered. We're not hearing Sumerian as a living language. We're hearing Sumerian as canon, curated, systematized, frozen into school templates. The scribes who preserved it knew a great deal about their own tradition, but they were also capable of misreading it. Their misunderstandings can quietly become ours. On top of that, the script itself won't sit still. Over more than 1,000 years, Sumerian writing goes through cycles of simplification and elaboration. Signs split into variants, their shapes shift, their potential values multiply. A sign that once pictured a star can be read as star, or as sky, or as the name of a god, or as the syllable used in that god's name. Another sign, originally house, might be pressed into service to write a sound that appears in temple, palace, and enclosure, and then, in some periods, carry specialized meanings in law codes that we can only guess at. Scholars talk about semantic drift, the slow movement of meaning over time. This same cluster of wedges, copied faithfully over centuries, gradually acquires new associations. In one city, it's used for a local office, in another, for a slightly different role. In a ritual context, it might have a metaphorical sense that never appears in dry administrative records. We can reconstruct some of this from context and parallel texts, but not all. Even when we can translate the words of a Sumerian passage, there are layers that may never fully come across. Think about puns. Sumerian texts love them. A hymn might hinge on a word that means both mountain and foreign land, or a king's name might echo a common verb, letting a line mean two things at once. To a native listener, that double meaning would be obvious, maybe even the main point of the line. On a modern translation, it becomes a footnote, or vanishes entirely. Then there's register, the difference between everyday speech and formal, ritual, or archaic language. Some Sumerian hymns are full of deliberately old-fashioned forms, even for their own time, echoing earlier styles the way a modern prayer might echo King James Bible English. Legal formulas in contracts can preserve phrases that no one would ever say in casual conversation. Without a living speaker to tell us which bits feel stiff or colloquial, we're guessing from distribution and later scribal comments. Ritual language adds another layer. Incantations and liturgies often use stock phrases, technical terms for demons or ritual objects, and metaphorical names for deities. A line might refer to a god with a title that makes perfect sense inside a specific temple tradition, but looks opaque to us. Local references, an epithet tied to a particular festival, a play on a city's name, a proverb everyone knew, can slide right past us as if they were ordinary words. Even something as simple as humour is hard to catch. There are Sumerian proverbs and dialogues that clearly play with social roles, stereotypes and wordplay, but without being steeped in that world, we're left unsure where the laugh is supposed to land, or how sharp the joke was. Faced with all this, responsible scholarship operates with a kind of disciplined humility. When a line is clear, based on multiple parallel texts and well-understood vocabulary, translations are confident. When a word is rare, or a construction unique, or a passage sits in a genre full of technical terms, modern editions will often mark the uncertainty. Brackets, question marks, alternative renderings in the notes. They're all ways of saying, we can read the signs, but the exact flavour of this sentence may be lost. Over time, careful work narrows the gaps. New tablets are joined. Previously unknown lexical lists surface in museum collections. A word that puzzled everyone in a myth suddenly appears in a medical text with a clear gloss. A local reference becomes legible when archaeology uncovers a city's layout or its patron deity. But some gaps are structural. Without living relatives for Sumerian, without native speakers, there are meanings that may remain permanently fuzzy. The emotional weight of certain metaphors, the full resonance of a ritual phrase, the exact social nuance of a title or insult. That doesn't make the effort futile. It just means that when we say we understand Sumerian, we're always speaking in layers. We can map its grammar, reconstruct much of its vocabulary, and follow its narratives. We can in many cases know what happened, who did what to whom, and which god was invoked. But the fine grain, the jokes, the in-group references, the way a line might have made a temple audience shiver or smile, that often remains in half-shadow. And this half-shadow matters, especially when we turn to the texts that look backwards, even from Sumerian's point of view. Tablets that claim to list kings who reigned before the flood, cities that rose and fell twice, dynasties that stretch time beyond anything we consider realistic. To see how those shadows and clarities interact, We have to leave the language for a moment and look at the places where Sumerian scribes kept their memories, their libraries, their archives, and the long, fragile chains of copying that brought some text to us and let others quietly break. When we say library, most of us picture shelves of books, open stacks, maybe a quiet reading room. Mesopotamian reality was different. The earliest archives are not about leisure reading, they're about control. In a Sumerian city, the biggest concentrations of writing lived in temples and palaces. The temple, as economic centre, kept tablets for offerings, rentals of land, loans of barley, the rations owed to workers and priests. The palace kept tablets for labour forces, tax deliveries, diplomatic letters, military supplies, royal decrees. Both are archives, but they breathe differently. Temple archives tend to be continuous. Day after day, year after year, scribes recorded the slow heartbeat of the institution. This much grain in, this much oil out, this person promoted, this field remeasured. Many of these tablets were filed by year or by type, then packed away when they were no longer actively needed, forming dense, localized time capsules of the temple's life. Palace records could be more episodic. A new king comes to power, a huge building project begins, military campaigns ramp up, tribute flows in, sudden bursts of documentation, followed by periods of quiet, then bursts again when political fortunes shift. Letters between rulers, treaties, intelligence reports, even lists of omens consulted before a battle. The palace archive is the nervous system of state. Much later, when empires like Assyria and Neo-Babylon rose, something else appears alongside these pragmatic archives: curated royal libraries. Kings such as Ashurbanipal did not just store day-to-day paperwork. They collected. They ordered scribes to copy all the tablets of the land. Myths, epics, omen series, medical handbooks, lexical lists, rituals, incantations, ancient royal inscriptions. These were not held because someone needed to know how many jars of beer were issued last month. They were held because they were considered knowledge worth preserving, a canon. From our perspective, the distinction matters because it shapes what survives. Temple and palace archives, by their nature, were local and practical. When a city fell, the building might burn, the roof collapse, the tablets scatter. Later inhabitants could reuse the same space, crushing and mixing layers. Parts of the archive become a compacted mass of broken clay. Other rooms vanish entirely under erosion or later construction. Royal libraries, on the other hand, often sat in monumental complexes. When those went up in flames during sieges, something paradoxical happened. The clay tablets, normally dried in the sun, were suddenly exposed to intense heat. They baked. What would have crumbled with time turned ceramic and durable. This is one reason we find so many cuneiform texts in broken but still legible form. War and accident turned fragile administrative tools and scholarly notebooks into something like bricks. But fire was only one force. Looting pulled archives apart. In antiquity, rivals carried off prized tablets as trophies or reused them as building fill. In modern times, illicit digging and the artifact trade scattered tablets into private collections and museum storerooms worldwide, usually without proper records of where they came from. Erosion and water damage ate away at exposed layers. Walls collapsed, smashing neatly stacked tablets into sherds. Clay, once fractured, is easily ground down by centuries of dust and feet. Some archives survive as dense pockets of crushed fragments, more like bags of gravel than bookshelves. And there was recycling. Clay was cheap, but not free of labour. In some periods, old tablets were deliberately soaked, kneaded back into usable clay, and reshaped into new ones. A text that someone judged outdated or irrelevant could literally be unwritten. We only know this happened because a few tablets preserve ghost impressions from earlier writing under the newer text, a palimpsest in 3 dimensions. Put all of it together, and you end up with what Assyriologists sometimes call the broken book problem. A single composition, an epic, a long ritual, a king list, almost never reaches us as one intact tablet set sitting neatly on a shelf. Instead, it exists as dozens, sometimes hundreds of fragments dispersed across time and space. One piece might have been dug up in the 19th century at Nineveh and shipped to London. Another, from a slightly different copy, might have been found at a provincial site a century later and end up in Istanbul. A third might sit unidentified in a box in a regional museum, its surface barely cleaned. None of them say, "Hello, we belong to the same lost book." Working out those connections is its own slow detective story. Scholars talk about joins. A physical join is when 2 fragments literally fit together, the breaks matching like puzzle pieces. But even that is rarely simple. A broken edge might be worn, or a chunk missing. Partial joins, where the curve of a tablet and the angle of a crack suggest a fit, require experience and a good deal of caution. Beyond pure geometry, there are other clues. Handwriting, for one. Individual scribes had characteristic ways of drawing particular wedges, more slanted here, deeper there, a habit of closing or opening a corner. Over time and in specific schools, those habits form what amounts to a local script accent. A fragment with the same hand as another can hint that the 2 came from the same tablet, or at least the same workshop. Clay fabric helps too. The composition of the clay, its colour, the size and type of grit or chaff in it, can match across pieces. A scribe using a specific clay mixture in one city, at one period, leaves a material fingerprint. If 2 fragments share that fingerprint and the same general format and handwriting, they may well be siblings. Then there are the signs themselves. Cuneiform sign forms change over time. The way a particular sign is drawn in the early 2nd millennium is not quite the way it's drawn in the late 1st. Some scribal traditions maintain archaic forms for sacred or prestigious texts. Others modernize, matching the style of sign forms, the layout of lines, the use of spacing or rulings. These are all part of confirming that 2 bits once lived together. Finally, there is the internal text. Repeated phrases, formulaic openings and closings, sequences known from better preserved copies. A fragment that begins midline with "after 7 days and 7 nights" might neatly follow another that ends "they waited in darkness," even if they were found on opposite sides of the ancient world. When a join is made, literal or textual, suddenly a few more words of an ancient story snap into place. A broken sentence becomes complete. A previously unknown line of a king list extends a dynasty backwards. A gap in a ritual liturgy fills with a crucial instruction, but the broken book reality also means we live with edges. Sometimes all we have is a tantalizing start. In those days when the foundations of heaven and earth were not yet, and then the tablet breaks. Sometimes we have the ending of something extraordinary, and thus he measured out the years from before the flood until now, with no middle to tell us what was measured or how. We can see the frame of a narrative that someone, thousands of years ago, thought important enough to copy, to store, to pass down. We can see that it spoke of times already ancient to them, kings before kings, cities before cities, floods before all known floods. And yet, because the physical object broke, because walls fell and archives burned and clay was repurposed, we may never know what those missing lines said. It's a strange kind of closeness. The story's presence is undeniable. Its centre is gone. That tension becomes especially sharp when we turn to one of the most famous broken books of Mesopotamia, the king lists that calmly count reigns in tens of thousands of years and place a line, then the flood swept over, between a world we can half recognize and a world that feels entirely out of scale. The text that gathers those impossible numbers into one continuous story is usually called, very simply, the Sumerian king list. It is not one tablet. It is not even one version of a tablet. It's a tradition, stitched together over centuries by different scribes in different cities, each with their own loyalties and their own sense of what the past ought to look like. The basic idea is straightforward on the surface. The list presents a single line of kingship passed like a sacred object from city to city. When kingship descended from heaven, it says, kingship was in Eridu. Then later, kingship was taken to Bad Tibera, then to Larok, then to Sippar, and so on, moving across the Sumerian landscape like a torch in a relay race. Dynasties rise and fall. Capitals shift. After a flood, the list says, kingship is lowered from heaven again and begins anew in another city. For rulers living 1,000 or more years after the earliest entries, this was a powerful way to think about legitimacy. You aren't just some strong man who grabbed power. You're the next link in a chain that supposedly goes back to the very first crowned human beings, chosen at the dawn of time. Of course, reality was messier. Cities competed. Sometimes there were overlapping local kings. At times, southern and northern dynasties coexisted. But in the king list, that tangle becomes a single file line. It's memory, edited into a smooth sequence. The feature that makes the list so famous and so unsettling is what it does with time. In the earlier sections, before the flood, reign lengths are not given in decades or generations. They are measured in strings of numbers that feel like they belong to geology, not government. One king is said to have ruled 28,800 years, another 36,000. One reign lasts 43,200 years, a number that, coincidentally or not, equals 120 ser in their sexagesimal system. The list runs through 8 antediluvian kings ruling for hundreds of thousands of years in total, and then quite calmly says, then the flood swept over. After that, the numbers begin to shrink. You get dynasties where kings rule for 1,200 years, then 900, then 600, then 120. Eventually, by the middle and late portions of the list, the reigns settle into spans that look vaguely human. A decade, 30 years, 40, maybe 60 for a particularly durable monarch. The curve is striking. Mythic vastness, then a kind of long, sloping descent into something like real history. Scholars have approached those outlandish early numbers from several directions, and none of them answers everything. One line of thought treats the numbers as symbolic. The Sumerians used a base 60 system and had favoured large units, like the Sar of 3,600, that appear repeatedly in mathematical texts. Many of the extreme reigns are simple multiples of these units, 10 ser, 12 ser, 60 ser. In that view, the numbers are not trying to be literal lifespans. They're telling you something about status and cosmic order. A king whose reign is 120 ser is not a guy who actually sat on a throne for 43,200 solar years. He is an axis point, a marker of a completed cycle. Another approach sees the list as mythic framing around a historical core. Early kings, especially those before the flood, may have started as deified ancestors, culture heroes, or local gods. Later scribes, wanting to integrate many city traditions into one genealogy, turned them into kings with suitably awe-inspiring reigns. The impossible numbers are a way of signalling that these figures stand on the boundary between the human world and whatever came before. There is also the political reading. When a city rose to prominence, its scribes had every incentive to extend its pedigree. If your city can claim that its first dynasty began right after the flood, and that its earliest king ruled for 28,800 years, you've just carved out a narrative of cosmic seniority. You weren't just lucky in war last generation. You were meant to rule from the beginning. That kind of ideological inflation leaves traces in the list. Emphasis on certain cities, smoothing over awkward periods of foreign rule, telescoping parallel dynasties into a single line. And then there's the very mundane possibility of imperfect transmission. Copyists could misread or miswrite numerical signs, especially when dealing with damaged exemplars or archaic notation. Over centuries, small copying slips can accumulate. A reign of 120 years could become 1,200. 1,200 could become 12,000, especially if the scribe is already working within a tradition that expects enormous numbers at the start. The king list, remember, exists as multiple manuscripts with variants between them. Some versions inflate particular reigns, others shorten them. Our official text is already a patchwork reconstruction. Despite all that uncertainty, the list is not pure fantasy. From roughly the early 2nd millennium BCE onward, parts of it begin to intersect with rulers we know from other sources. Names such as Enmebaragesi of Kish appear in both the king list and in independent inscriptions on stone or metal objects found in archaeological layers. Later on, kings like Sargon of Akkad, his grandson Naram-Sin, and the rulers of Ur's third dynasty, Shulgi, Amar-Sin, Shu-Sin, Ibi-Sin, show up both in the list and in contemporary administrative tablets, year-name formulas, and monumental building inscriptions. Here we can cross-check. We can line up sequences of kings with dated economic text from specific cities. We can see that for certain periods, the relative order of dynasties in the king list matches the stratigraphy in the ground. A level of destruction followed by a new city's pottery style and new royal names. Synchronisms, like a treaty between two rulers both named in the list, help anchor parts of the sequence to a rough absolute chronology. Even so, the anchoring is partial. There are gaps where archaeological evidence is thin. There are kings we know from their own inscriptions who do not appear in the list at all, and vice versa. The king list is curated history, not a neutral ledger. When you move back toward its front, toward the long-reigning antediluvian kings and the curious period right after the flood, that anchor chain runs out of links. We have no layers in Eridu that clearly say, here lies the city during the 28,800-year reign of Alulim. No continuous line of datable monuments that reaches unbroken from the late 3rd millennium back into the hazy era of the first dynasties. Instead, we have scattered early cities, each with their own rise and fall recorded in mud brick and trash pits, and a literary tradition that insists they're all part of a continuous, divinely guided rulership stretching back into an inhuman past. The Sumerian king list sits exactly at that junction. It is one of our best windows onto how early Mesopotamians imagined the depth of time, how they stitched myth, memory, and politics into something like a timeline. It tells us there was a before, a period of kingship so ancient that human years no longer apply, and a catastrophic line. Then the flood swept over, that separates that unreachable era from the more recent past we can sometimes touch, with excavated bricks and datable tablets. On one side of that line, our tools work better. On the other, we are left squinting at multiplied SAR and perfect multiples of 60, knowing that for the people who wrote them, these numbers were not nonsense. They were meaningful measures of a world whose contours we can no longer quite reconstruct. Somewhere between those towering reigns and the first kings we can actually pin to specific walls and doorways, the record passes from before us into within our grasp. The king list stands on that threshold, calmly counting years that feel like eternity, inviting us to follow, but never quite letting us know where exactly those first names stood on the earth. When the king list says, then the flood swept over, it is not inventing that idea from nowhere. Floods are the pulse of Mesopotamia. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates is made by rivers that can be generous or murderous depending on the year. Snowmelt in distant mountains, late rains, a shift in a riverbed. Any of these can turn an expected rise of water into a sudden black wall full of uprooted trees and dead animals. For the people who built the first cities on those plains, floods were not abstract symbols. They were things you heard coming in the night, felt under your feet, saw afterward in the silt line halfway up your house. So when we read Mesopotamian texts about a great flood that ends one age and begins another, there are two realities layered on top of each other. On one layer, there is hard experience. Communities drowned, canals buried, crops ruined for a generation. Archaeologists digging through the tells of ancient cities do find flood deposits, thick lenses of river mud lying between older and newer levels of occupation. At Uruk, at Kish, at other sites, there are bands of water-laid silt that suggest serious inundations sometime in the late 4th or early 3rd millennium BCE. On another layer there is story. There is the idea of one flood that matters more than all the others, a single, divinely sent catastrophe that wipes the slate clean. You see that second layer most clearly in the Atrahasis epic. Atrahasis is an old Babylonian composition, written down in the early 2nd millennium but drawing on older Sumerian traditions. It tells of how the gods make humans to carry out labour, how humans multiply and become noisy, and how the chief god Enlil, irritated by their clamour, decides to thin them out. First comes plague, then famine, then drought. Each time a god sympathetic to humans, usually Enki or Ea, quietly instructs a human leader on how to survive. Each time the plan works, humans bounce back. The noise returns. Finally Enlil opts for the most drastic measure, a flood that'll extinguish humanity entirely. Again, the friendly god leaks the plan. He tells Atrahasis to dismantle his house and build a boat, to bring aboard the seed of life of every kind, to seal the vessel with pitch. The waters rise, the storm rages, and when it is over, Atrahasis offers sacrifice on dry land. The smell of the offering brings the gods, who suddenly regret the near-total loss of their human workforce. In the end, there is compromise. Humans will remain, but with new limits. Mortality, infant death, social rules about reproduction. The flood becomes a hinge. Before it, there is a kind of unchecked, noisy abundance. After it, there is the constrained, fragile human world we know. The flood story inserted into the Epic of Gilgamesh is closely related. In the standard version, the hero meets Utnapishtim, a man who, like Atrahasis, survived a god-sent deluge by building a boat and riding out the storm with his family and animals. Utnapishtim recounts how his city, Shuruppak, was warned in secret, how he covered the boat, watched the storm blot out the light, released birds to test for land, how, at the end, his boat grounded on a distant mountain. It is in that tablet, the famous Flood Tablet, that readers first noticed the startling parallel with the biblical story of Noah, a righteous man, a divine warning, a boat of specific dimensions, animals preserved, birds released. The echoes do not mean that one text simply copied the other, but they do show that a particular Mesopotamian way of imagining a world-ending flood radiated outward and took on new forms in later traditions. What links Atrahasis, the Gilgamesh flood, and the Sumerian king list is the idea of an antediluvian era, a before-the-flood world that is not just earlier in time, but fundamentally different in quality. In the king list, that difference is expressed through reign lengths. Before the flood, kings rule for tens of thousands of years. After, their reigns shrink down step by step toward mortal human spans. In atrahasis, it's expressed through conditions of life. Before the flood, humans are numerous and noisy and long-lived. After, they're capped, fragile, subject to death and disease. In later Sumerian tales, there are antediluvian cities and sages who live before the waters, guardians of primordial knowledge. Lists of learned men sometimes begin with these pre-flood figures, as if to say, even our scholarship has a prehistory. For modern readers, it is tempting to take these converging lines and ask, so was there a real, single flood? We have some data to work with. There is evidence for large-scale flooding in parts of southern Mesopotamia. There are broader debates about rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, about catastrophic outburst floods in other regions. But the match is never clean. The geological record around early Mesopotamian cities shows multiple flood events of varying scale, not one global catastrophe. The dates of particular silt layers do not line up perfectly with the mythic timelines we can infer, and the texts themselves are not eyewitness reports. They are theological narratives, refined by generations of copying and retelling, interested less in meteorology than in questions of order, justice, and human limitation. So we have to separate types of evidence. On one side, river deposits, soil cores, stratigraphic profiles that record episodes of inundation in particular valleys at particular times. These can tell us, roughly, when a given city was hit hard by water. On the other, literary motifs, a divine council debating human fate, a secretly warned hero, a boat loaded with life, birds sent out over receding waters, a sacrifice that re-establishes a bond between gods and survivors. These elements travel from one text to another, sometimes in Sumerian, sometimes in Akkadian, sometimes centuries apart. Theological framing sits on top of both. The flood is not just bad weather, it is a tool of cosmic management, a way for powerful beings to reset a noisy, overgrown world, a line drawn through time that legitimizes new arrangements, new rules for human life, new centers of kingship. Why then did Mesopotamian scribes keep circling back to this before the flood horizon? Part of the answer may be psychological. If your city stands on alluvial ground, 1 or 2 bad years can erase the work of generations. A story in which such destruction is not random but chosen, used to mark a change in the rules, may be easier to live with than the thought of pure accident. Part of it is political, claiming a link to antediluvian kings, antediluvian sages, or a city that existed before the flood gives your dynasty a kind of antique glow. It makes your present order look like the restored continuation of something unimaginably ancient, interrupted only briefly by catastrophe. And part of it is simply the scribal imagination. For people whose job was to copy, compare, and comment on old texts, the before the flood world was the ultimate lost archive, a time when lifespans were vast, when gods and humans spoke more directly, when the first patterns of rule and knowledge were set. The tablets that talk about that world are not themselves antediluvian. They are much later, composed long after any real flood layers we can see in the ground. But they preserve, in their own carefully incised lines, a memory that earlier humans once stood on riverbanks, looking at a landscape scraped flat by water, and decided that history itself must have been divided by that kind of event. On one bank of that imagined river, humans who are almost more than human, living in spans we can't quite picture. On the other, short-lived kings, scribes, merchants, and farmers, people like us with records we can read. Between them, the flood, broad and dark, washing away most of what came before, leaving only a few names and numbers bobbing on the surface of later texts. If the flood is the great break in Mesopotamian memory, the clay tablet is the opposite, a thing that refuses to break cleanly. Clay keeps almost too well. Fires that destroyed buildings baked archives harder. Walls that collapsed turned shelves of tablets into compacted airless bricks. For thousands of years they lay there, sealed. When they finally come out of the ground, they can look disconcertingly fresh. Edgelines crisp, wedges sharp, the surface still carrying the impression of a fingernail or a scribe's palm. And yet, for all that survival, most of what we have from the earliest phases of writing is only partly readable. When people say there are untranslated tablets sitting in museums, it sounds as if we have whole libraries written in an alien language that no one can crack. Occasionally there are a few that really are like that, but much more often, untranslated is a shorthand for something less dramatic and more mundane. Sometimes it means no one has had the time. There are tens of thousands of tablets and collections around the world that have been catalogued only at the most basic level. A number, a date, a rough description like account text or letter. To move beyond that, a specialist has to sit down with each piece, read it, compare its signs to others, decide if it's worth publishing. Academic careers and funding cycles are finite. There are always more tablets than person hours. Sometimes untranslated means the tablet itself is too far gone. Clay shrinks and cracks, corners flake off. Surfaces get abraded by ancient feet or modern handling. Fire can warp the shape just enough that signs buckle and overlap. What you end up with is a constellation of surviving wedges floating in a sea of loss. You can see that the text used to say something, but crucial bits, the verb, the name, the number, are sitting in the missing part. And sometimes untranslated just means it is readable, but only if you already live inside a very technical niche. A tablet listing cattle deliveries, written in cramped archaic shorthand, with local month names and profession titles that occur nowhere else, might be legible to the 2 or 3 people on Earth who specialize in that archive. To everyone else, it might as well be blank. Even when the surface is good and the writing is clear, obstacles stack up. There are damaged lines where one burr of clay erases the difference between 2 signs. There are rare sign forms used only in one city, or only for a few generations, where we have too few examples to be sure what sound or word they represent. There are bits of local jargon, cult titles, nicknames for storehouses, in-house abbreviations for weights and measures. Often, tablets assume that the reader has access to other texts that we no longer possess. A school exercise might say, as is written in the list, and then give only the second half of something. A legal document will refer to the usual oath, without spelling it out. A letter might allude to the matter we discussed last month. The parallels that made those half-statements meaningful are gone. We get the echo, but not the original sound. And then there is ambiguity built into the script itself. Cuneiform signs are not one-to-one with sounds the way our alphabet mostly is. A single sign can be read as a whole word, or as a syllable, or as several different syllables depending on context. The same sequence of wedges might mean temple, or house of X-god, or an abstract idea like protection, or just be the spelling of someone's personal name. Scribes developed conventions to keep things straight, little helper signs, patterns of placement, but those conventions shifted over time and varied by region. Grammar also evolved. Case endings changed, verb forms drifted, particles came in and out of use. For the earlier stages, Sumerian itself is a moving target, and the way it is represented in writing is not always transparent. So a line of wedges that everyone can technically read can still be contested. Does this verb govern both objects or just the second one? Is that city name actually the name of a temple quarter? When a king says he fixed the foundation of the land, is that a literal dam project or a stock phrase for restoring order? Different scholars can propose different readings, each consistent with known grammar, and the clay doesn't tell us which is right. Turning a tablet from artifact into something that can be used as its own miniature epic. It usually begins with documentation, high-resolution photographs, taken in raking light from different angles. Increasingly 3D scans and reflectance imaging that let you relight the surface virtually and catch faint signs. Then someone makes a hand copy, a line drawing of every wedge, every break, every suspicious scratch. This seems redundant next to photography, but for cuneiform it still matters. The act of tracing forces the editor to decide what counts as a stroke and what is accident. Those decisions are part of the interpretation. From there, the text is transliterated. Each sign is rendered into Latin letters according to agreed conventions. Logograms, signs used as whole words, are usually written in capitals. Syllabic uses appear in lowercase. Uncertain readings get dots or question marks. Broken parts are marked with brackets. The result looks strange, but it is the working space where philologists test out what the scribe might have intended. Only after that comes translation, and even then what appears on the page is rarely just a smooth paragraph. It is accompanied by commentary, notes about unusual spellings, parallels in other tablets, reasons for choosing one meaning over another, alternative possibilities. In effect, an addition is an argument in public. Here is how, step by step, I rebuilt this fragment of the past. When you zoom out, the mystery that surrounds the oldest tablets is less about secret content than about method. We're not waiting for a single decipherer to say the magic word that will unlock antediluvian wisdom. We are watching a much slower, more fragile process. Knowledge reconstructed from crumbs, in which every added tablet, every improved photograph, every re-examined sign slightly shifts the picture. The gaps that remain, the half-lines, the broken names, the unglossed technical terms, are not proof that the past is hiding something from us on purpose. They are reminders of how thin our connection to it is, and how much of what once filled those archives has simply dissolved into mud. And yet, out of that mud, meaning keeps emerging. Not all at once, not perfectly, but line by line, edition by edition, as if we were standing on the far bank of time, trying to hear voices from a washed-out world and patiently teaching ourselves their language again. Mesopotamia feels difficult enough. At least, though, we can hear it, even if the words are sometimes muffled. Elsewhere, there are scripts where we don't even know what the voice is supposed to sound like. If you step away from the Tigris and Euphrates and walk east, across Iran and into Pakistan and northwest India, you reach one of the great enigmas of early writing, the Indus, or Harappan script. It shows up on seals, little stone objects carved with animals and human figures, with tiny clusters of signs above them. It appears on ceilings, on pottery, on a few bits of metal. The civilization that used it built well-planned cities, massive drainage systems, standardized weights and measures. They traded as far as Mesopotamia. They clearly ran some kind of complex organized society, and yet their writing will not speak. Part of the problem is sheer length. Most Indus inscriptions are 4, 6, maybe 10 signs long. They're like eternal license plates, structured, patterned, but painfully brief. There are no surviving long texts, no narrative, no legal formula that we can follow from beginning to end and watch the grammar at work. Another problem, we don't know what language those signs were trying to represent. With cuneiform, we can watch Sumerian give way to Akkadian, then see Hittite, Hurrian, Elamite, and others squeezed into the wedge system. At various points, bilingual and trilingual monuments explain what is going on. A sign that means king in Sumerian is glossed in Akkadian. A god's name is written both logographically and syllabically. Over centuries, scribes themselves wrote dictionaries. For the Indus script, there is nothing like that, We have no Rosetta Stone, no later empire that borrowed the signs and left us explanatory lists. The spoken language underneath could have been an ancestor of Dravidian, or something Indo-Aryan-like, or a language family that vanished entirely. Scholars can test patterns, frequency of certain signs, positions in the line, and compare them to what we see in known languages. Some models fit a bit better than others. None has enough evidence to close the case. And hovering over everything is a third obstacle: no true bilingual texts. Cuneiform had a crucial advantage. At several points in its history, it stood next to another script that we already understand. An Akkadian king who carved his achievements in wedge-shaped signs might also commission a version in alphabetic Aramaic. Hittite rulers used cuneiform for their archives, but inscriptions in their own hieroglyphs echoed some of the same names and formulas. Eventually, scholars could triangulate. The Indus world did not give us that foothold. When Harappan merchants stamped their seals on bales headed for Mesopotamia, they used Indus signs. When Mesopotamian scribes mentioned those merchants or their cities, they wrote the names in cuneiform, in their own phonetic system, with no hint that the signs corresponded to anything on the seals. The two scripts passed each other like ships in the night. Another famous silence sits out in the Aegean, Linear A, the script of the Minoan palaces on Crete. Here, the signs look more promising at first glance. They're related to Linear B, the script that the Mycenaean Greeks later used for an early form of Greek. Linear B was deciphered in the mid-20th century. Once that happened, it became possible to read those tablet archives, lists of chariot wheels, allocations of grain, records of offerings to gods. Linear A uses many of the same signs. We can often guess what sound a particular sign contributed in the later system, but when we apply those values to Linear A text, the result is not Greek. It is something else, a language we do not recognize. Again, the same trio of problems appears. The tablets are mostly administrative, not literary. Short entries, repetitive formulas, numbers and commodities. Very few phrases long enough to show us complex grammar. No bilinguals, no later tradition that looked back and said, "This is what the old Cretan texts say." The sound values we borrow from Linear B might not all hold. Even a few mismatches can scramble the whole signal. So we end up with half decipherments. We can tell that a sequence is probably a place name, because it appears after a sign that elsewhere seems to mark locations. We can see that a certain sign group clusters around numbers in a way that suggests a unit of measure. We begin to glimpse structure, but not meaning in the ordinary sense. The temptation is to jump ahead. When you stare at any undeciphered script long enough, patterns start to look like words you know. A series of repeating signs must surely be king, or offering, or god. An animal pictured beside an inscription must be the subject of the text. Occasionally, someone announces that the Indus script has been cracked, or that Linear A is this or that known language. Responsible work moves more slowly. Statistical analysis can map how often signs occur, which ones cluster, how they appear at the beginnings or ends of lines. That can tell us whether we are looking at something truly linguistic or a symbol system of another kind. Comparative studies can test hypothetical sound values and see if the resulting language behaves like a human language, with the usual mix of repetition and variation, function words and content words, or falls apart. These approaches build constraints, not finished translations. They let us say, "It is unlikely that this sign stands for a full sentence," or "This sequence probably cannot be a personal name." They rule out whole families of explanations and leave a smaller, more realistic space for possibilities. Compared to that, cuneiform looks almost generous. The Mesopotamian scribes left us long documents, ritual collections, legal compilations, school texts that spell things out step by step. They borrowed and adapted their script for new languages across millennia. They created sign lists, word lists, even explicit Sumerian to Akkadian vocabularies. They made enough noise on clay that we can, with effort, reconstruct their phonology, grammar, and much of their mental world. Even then, as we've seen, we argue over verbs and particles and metaphors. With Indus, with Linear A, with other short-lived or locally confined systems, we stand farther back from the door. We can see that someone carved something deliberate into stone and clay. We can sense that those marks once linked to tax systems, mythologies, lineages, but we cannot yet and may never hear the sentences themselves. There are more of these locked doors scattered across the early world, the still obscure signs on Easter Island's Ronga-Ronga boards. The earliest, sparsest pictographic systems along the Nile that predate full Egyptian hieroglyphs. Local scripts that flicker into existence on a handful of artifacts and then vanish without leaving descendants. Each one hints at a world of names and stories, of rules and rituals that ran in parallel to the better documented traditions. Mesopotamia is unusual, not because it invented writing, but because its writing lasted so long, in so many hands, that we caught it in enough stages to work backward. In other places the experiment was shorter. The clay broke, or the wood rotted, or the next conquest brought a new script and no one bothered to preserve the old one. When we talk about the earliest world as if it were a single place, we are smoothing over this variety. There were many early worlds, each speaking its own language, each choosing its own set of marks to tie sound to matter. Some of those systems left us just enough clues to rebuild whole histories. Others remain like distant lights through fog, patterns without words. Cuneiform, for all its gaps and ambiguities, is one of the few where the door is open part way. To understand how extraordinary that is, and how fragile, it helps to look back at the people who kept that door from closing completely, the scribes who copied, reorganized, and sometimes reinvented texts that were already ancient in their own time. If you were born into the right family in ancient Mesopotamia, you might spend your childhood not in the fields, but hunched over damp clay. The path to becoming a scribe was long and brutal in its own way. You learned cuneiform the hard way, copying the same signs again and again until your hand could produce them automatically. First numbers and simple wedges, then lists of professions, plants, animals, then model contracts, royal formulas, hymns. It was an elite education. Scribes served in temples and palaces, managed accounts, drafted legal texts, drew up boundary stones. They were the ones who could turn spoken commands into permanent marks and permanent marks back into action. That literacy gave them status in a world where almost no one else could read or write. And built into that status was an ethic. You weren't just writing, you were copying. Again and again, tablet after tablet, generation after generation, scribes took older compositions and recast them on fresh clay. School text preserve this process vividly. A teacher's master tablet sits in front. The student's version, often riddled with errors, sits beside it. Over time, students graduate from simple word lists to complicated literary works. Some of the most famous Mesopotamian texts endure because of this habit of copying. The Epic of Gilgamesh survives not in one pristine original, but in dozens of versions, many of them from a much later period than the story's first composition. Lore collections, like the Code of Hammurabi, were recopied long after Hammurabi himself was dead. Even Sumerian hymns were still being copied in the first millennium BCE, when Sumerian as a spoken language had already vanished. This is where copies matter. Clay breaks, libraries burn, riverbanks collapse and wash archives away. The earliest tablets from the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE exist only in fragments and chance survivals. But a text that was recited, taught, and recopied in scribal schools had multiple chances to leap from one fragile piece of clay to another. A hymn written around 2100 BCE might survive only because a diligent scribe in 700 BCE decided to include it in his exercise tablet. The physical tablet from the early period might be gone forever. The words are not, because they migrated into new clay centuries later. That migration wasn't random. Over time, scribes curated what we might call a canon, not in the strict closed sense of a religious scripture, but in the practical sense of things worth keeping. School exercises show repeated sets of compositions that students were expected to master. Long lists of signs and words became standardized. Certain epics, laments, rituals, and prayers recur over and over. You can see the choices being made. Kings deserve to be remembered, so king lists and royal inscriptions are copied. Omens matter for running a kingdom, so enormous collections of omen texts, everything from liver divination to the behavior of newborn animals to the appearance of eclipses, are maintained and expanded. Ritual instructions, incantations against demons and disease, are recopied because they are still in use. Epics and myths are preserved because they are recited at festivals, because they shape how people imagine gods, cities, and themselves. Lists themselves become a genre. There are lists of cities, lists of deities ranked by status, lists of professions, lists of rare words paired with more common synonyms. Some are practical teaching tools, others feel like attempts to hold an entire world steady by naming it, category by category. Behind all this is a kind of curated memory. By the first millennium BCE, the scribes of Babylonia and Assyria knew that much of what they copied was already ancient. They label some materials as old or from before the flood. Royal inscriptions sometimes boast that a king has restored the ancient foundation inscription of a predecessor. Libraries like the one at Nineveh contain tablets where a catalogue entry proudly notes that a particular text is a copy of an old tablet, which was worm-eaten found in the temple. Those phrases tell us two things at once. First, there was deliberate archiving. Scribes searched temple storerooms for crumbling tablets, recopying whatever they thought valuable, sometimes noting damaged lines, sometimes guessing at missing bits. They weren't simply writing for the present. They were actively pulling the past into their own time. Second, there was a sense of earlier worlds. Ancient carried authority. A ritual said to be from of old had more weight. A king who based his building project on the earlier plan was aligning himself with a prestigious half-remembered past. In some texts, before the flood functions almost like a label for a different era altogether, a time when gods and semi-divine rulers walked the earth and reigned for impossible spans. We can feel echoes of nostalgia here, and also of power. By choosing which myths, which omen collections, which royal tales to copy and teach, scribes weren't only preserving memory, they were shaping it. They were deciding which stories about origins, kingship, and cosmic order would still be legible centuries later, and which would quietly dissolve back into mud brick and river silt. It's important to keep this grounded. Survival in the scribal canon doesn't prove that a text is historically accurate in the modern sense. A long king list faithfully copied for 1,000 years is still, at many points, more theology than chronology. A flood narrative cherished for its antiquity isn't a weather report. The Omen series that tries to read the future in the entrails of sheep tells us less about the cosmos and more about how people hope to manage uncertainty. What the copying does show, clearly, is value. These communities thought it mattered to remember certain kings and lineages, to rehearse certain catastrophes and restorations, to preserve particular rituals and lists of signs. They tied their present to an imagined deep past through the medium of tablets. Some of that past may reflect genuine, if distorted, memories of earlier climates, cities or dynasties. Some of it is mythic architecture, stories built to explain why the world is the way it is. For us, this curated archive creates a double mystery. On one level, we can watch the scribes at work, see their corrections, follow the evolution of a composition from one version to another. On another, we have to keep asking what lies behind the text they chose to keep. What older tablets never got copied? What episodes were trimmed? What alternative versions lived only in oral recitation and never made it into the clay? Those questions become especially sharp when we turn to the texts that claim to reach back before ordinary history. The king lists that stretch dynasties beyond plausibility, the flood stories that mark a dividing line between worlds. To see how far the scribes were willing to let time expand and how that shapes our faint picture of the earliest ages, we have to walk into those lists and let them tell us how long they thought their story had been running. If king lists stretch time backward, Omen texts stretch it forward. They start from a simple, very human feeling, the sense that the future is dangerous and that somewhere, if you look closely enough, the world must be dropping hints. Mesopotamian Omen literature is built on that feeling. At first glance, these tablets can look almost comically detailed and superstitious, but when you read them slowly, you can see something else. An attempt to systematize uncertainty, to make the unpredictable at least describable. The basic structure repeats across many series. If X is seen, then Y will happen. If a sheep's liver has a particular mark, if the moon is surrounded by a halo, if a woman gives birth to a child with an unusual feature, then a specific outcome is expected for the king, the city, the harvest. We don't have the first moment this style of writing began, but by the early 2nd millennium BCE, it has already become elaborate, and it probably builds on older, now lost layers that go back much closer to the first centuries of writing. Omen corpora are technical texts. They grow slowly, as observations are added, variants noted, edge cases squeezed in between older lines. Scribes copy them for generations, expand them, reorganize them into numbered tablets that together form a series. This makes them dense in a particular way. Where a myth might pause to paint a scene or repeat a poetic line, Omen tablets are packed with specialized vocabulary. They reference standard positions on a model liver, technical names for cloud formations, rare words for animal deformities. They assume that the reader knows a whole background of ritual practice. For modern translators, this is a problem. The language is often late, but the concepts can be very old. Some terms appear only in these Omen contexts and nowhere else. Others are written with logograms borrowed from Sumerian, but used in an Akkadian sentence. When a tablet is broken, you might be missing only a few wedges, but lose the crucial sign that tells you what is being described. The more specialized the tradition became, the further it drifted from everyday speech. It turned into a kind of insider code, intelligible if you had been trained in that line of work, opaque if you had not. That insider quality is one reason so many passages remain uncertain, even in texts that are otherwise deciphered. Still, the logic behind the writing is clear enough. First you watch, then you record, then you interpret. We can see the watching in the celestial logs. Series like Enuma Anu Enlil compile hundreds of omens about the moon, the sun, the planets, the appearance of stars and constellations. Night after night, scribes noted eclipses, halos, strange colours in the sky, the first rising of particular stars in particular months. The entries read almost like bare data points. In the month X, on day Y, the moon was eclipsed in this watch of the night, and its shadow approached from the north. Only after the description comes the consequence: good for the king, bad for the king, danger for a particular region, famine, rebellion, peace. On other tablets, the object of observation is not the sky but the surface of a sacrificed sheep's liver. Diviners learned to treat the liver as a kind of three-dimensional map. Zones on it corresponded to different parts of the kingdom or aspects of royal welfare. a bump, a groove, a missing fold. All of these had names and recorded implications. Again, the writing runs in structured patterns. If the path of the liver is split in two and its right part is long, the king will seize new territory. If the throne is missing, the king's throne will be overthrown. There are dream manuals too. They catalogue what it means to dream of falling, of losing teeth, of seeing a particular god, of being pursued by an animal. There are collections that treat the birth of unusual animals or children as signs: a calf with two heads, a lamb born with no ears, a child whose sex is ambiguous. Alongside these are tablets that modern scholars file under medical, but the line between medicine and omen is thin. A description of symptoms might be followed by both a prognosis and a ritual, the likely course of the disease and the incantation or offering meant to counter it. Ingredients are listed, preparations specified, days counted. If you pull back a little, an odd familiarity emerges. This is not random fear scribbled on clay. It is classification. Someone is trying to build a catalogue of correlations between signs and outcomes, to turn scattered experiences into reference material. The style is terse, almost like entries in a database: condition, parameter, result. But over each entry hovers an assumption we no longer share, that behind every irregularity lies a message from the gods, and that with enough careful noting the pattern of that message will become visible. In that sense, Omen series feels strangely modern and deeply alien at the same time. Modern because they prize regularity, accumulation of cases, systematic wording. Alien because the direction of reasoning runs through ritual. An eclipse is not an impersonal astronomical event. It is a warning addressed usually to the king. A spotted liver is not just biology. It is a verdict on policy and war. For the scribes who copied these series, the universe itself was legible. The sky, the organs of animals, the mishaps of daily life were all pages in a book written by higher powers. Their job was to teach future specialists how to read that book correctly. And for us, there is another layer of mystery. Omen texts sit right at the place where observation becomes writing. Some of the earliest continuous records we have from Mesopotamia are not narratives of what happened, but registers of what might happen if the world continues to behave as it has in the past. They are early experiments in prediction. Yet even when we know every sign on a tablet, we do not always know the experience behind it. The anxious night in the palace when a strange halo circled the moon, the tense silence as a diviner unfolded a liver and saw something no manual had prepared him for. In their effort to make the future less opaque, these civilizations left us long sequences of if, then, inscribed in clay. We can read many of the lines, but the mindset that linked observation, fear, ritual, and decision is harder to reconstruct. That gap between the precisely written and the only partially understood will matter even more when we turn to archaeology itself and ask what in all of this world of omens and lists can be checked against the ground, and what must remain, for now, a carefully recorded mystery. When we ask what in these texts can be checked, we're really asking how words meet dirt. Archaeology has a few main ways of answering. One is stratigraphy, the patient reading of layers in the ground. A city mound is a stack of occupations, newest on top, oldest at the bottom. When a tablet is found sealed in a room that clearly burned at the end of a particular layer, that burn layer can often be tied to a known destruction horizon. Sometimes we can correlate that horizon with other sites in the region, or with broader climate events. The tablet, the room, the pottery in the floor, the ash above it, they all belong to the same moment. Another line of evidence is radiocarbon, organic materials in the same layer as tablets. Charred seeds, scraps of reed matting, a beam fallen across the doorway, can be dated. The numbers come with ranges and error bars, but they give us a bracket for when that room was in use, when the tablet fell or was stored. Sealings add a different kind of information. Clay lumps impressed with cylinder seals were used to close jars, doors, and baskets. When those lumps are found still attached to a storage jar, or in piles where broken containers once stood, they tell us about administration. Who was authorizing what? Which offices existed? Which names were active at the same time? Sometimes a sealing carries a name and title we also see on tablets. Text and material join up, and then there is the wider material culture, the pottery styles, the tools, the layout of streets and walls, the animal bones in the trash pits, the plant remains in storage jars. These things tell us what people were actually eating, making, trading. They let us see whether the economic world described in tablets, rations, herds, shipments, lines up with what was physically present. In the best cases, the two pictures converge. A city like Ur or Nippur can produce royal inscriptions that boast of rebuilding temples, followed by archaeological levels that clearly show major construction phases, fresh brickwork, new layout. Administrative tablets in that same layer record deliveries of bricks, lists of workers, offerings at the newly restored shrine. The text says, "The king rebuilt the temple." The dirt shows a big, well-dated rebuild. The tablets name the temple and the officials in charge. The match is not perfect, but the general picture hangs together. A large building project, centralized labor. A cult center rising again after an earlier phase of decay. On a smaller scale, we can see similar alignments. Economic texts from a particular phase might record shifts in crops, more barley, less wheat, at the same time that seed remains in storage jars skew in that direction. Veterinary records and Omen tablets can talk about specific diseases of sheep and cattle, while animal bones show patterns of slaughter age and stress that fit large managed herds. In these moments, archaeology feels like it is quietly nodding along with the texts, but there's a constant temptation to push that nod into a full conversation, to make the ground confirm much more than it really can. Stories of floods invite this especially strongly. When a king list mentions a great flood before which kings ruled for thousands of years, and excavators at one site report a thick layer of river silt between older and younger levels, it is easy to say, here, this must be that flood. It might be. It might also be one of many serious floods in a river system that floods often. The sediment does not arrive labelled with the name of Utanapishti. The same pressure appears around big, famous names. If a text lists a king with a particular name and title and describes a campaign, there is a strong urge to tie every burned layer in the right century to that campaign, every impressive structure to that ruler. Over time, entire historical narratives can be built on thin threads. A few royal inscriptions, a couple of destruction levels, later chronicles that may already be reinterpreting earlier events. The danger is not that these identifications are always wrong. Many are plausible. The danger is that, once made, they harden too quickly into fact in popular retellings, even while specialists are still arguing. So it helps to think in terms of confidence levels. At one end are things that are widely accepted, because multiple, independent lines of evidence point the same way. That cuneiform was in use in Uruk by the late 4th millennium BCE, that tablets were used heavily for accounting before they were used for narrative, that there were city-states with temples, palaces, and complex bureaucracies in southern Mesopotamia by the early 3rd millennium. The stratigraphy, the tablets, the radiocarbon dates, the comparative study of scripts. None of these alone would be enough, but together they form a robust outline. Then there are reconstructions that are plausible but still debated. Whether a particular myth reflects a real historical drought, whether a named king unites several archaeological phases at different sites, whether certain Omen series truly preserve observations going all the way back to the first centuries of writing, or mostly reflect later compilation with a sprinkling of older material. Specialists will often talk in cautious terms here. Likely, consistent with. One interpretation is. The ground is suggestive, but the fit between story and soil is not tight enough to close the case. And then there are places where archaeology is almost silent. The emotional worlds described in laments, the precise ritual gestures behind a line of a liver omen, the way early Sumerian was actually pronounced when someone read a tablet aloud. Clay does not record these. Floors and walls can tell us where people stood. They cannot tell us what they thought as they watched a shadow pass across the moon. Early king lists that stretch back to antediluvian rulers, gods who personally handed over the me of civilization, primordial cities that rose from the river before any other. Here, archaeology has very little to say. We can show that some named cities existed in later periods. We can map where people were living before and after river shifts. But whether a specific before-the-flood king ever sat on a real throne in a real building is beyond what trenches and sherds can support. So the past becomes a conversation between fragmentary things and fragmentary words, a broken tablet quoting an older tradition, a collapsed wall whose bricks once framed a room where that tablet was read, a layer of ash that lines up with a chronicle's brief remark about the year the city burned. We move back and forth between them, letting each correct the other, letting each limit our imagination just enough. And what remains, the stretches where the texts hint and the ground keeps its secrets, is not a failure. It is part of the mystery that drew scribes to write in the first place, the sense that behind the ordered lists and the dated events lies a longer, stranger story, only partly visible from where they stood. Our reconstructions will always be drafts, written in pencil over layers of clay and silence. No matter how many tablets we read, there will be parts of that earliest world that archaeology can only circle around, never fully define. Which is why, when we say that no one can finish translating the first written world, we do not just mean that signs are broken or languages lost. We mean that the ground itself refuses to supply the missing chapters. So when we say no one can finish translating the earliest world, there is a simple, practical layer to that. The first is just scale. Between museum basements, university storerooms, and site depots that rarely make headlines, there are hundreds of thousands of tablets and tablet fragments from Mesopotamia alone. Some catalogues push that toward 1 million if you count every crumb. Only a fraction of these have been read, copied and published in a way other scholars can easily use. Some pieces were documented a century ago in handwritten notebooks that are themselves now archives in need of deciphering. Others sit in drawers with temporary field labels, waiting for someone to recognize that the odd triangle of clay in this box actually locks perfectly into the edge of a tablet in another country. There are not many people trained to do this. Cuneiform specialists spend years just learning to read the signs in 1 or 2 languages. Sumerian, Akkadian, maybe a bit of Elamite or Hittite. To handle the earliest tablets at Uruk, or the dense, almost shorthand-like signs of late scholarly texts, is another step again. It is slow work, done by a small global community, most of whom are also teaching, curating, or excavating. So some of the untranslated earliest world is simply sitting there, patiently, on shelves. Not because it is impossible, but because there are more tablets than lifetimes. But even if every tablet fragment were cleaned, photographed, and placed on a desk with a fresh graduate student and endless time, deeper limits would remain. The most obvious of these is missing context. A tablet that comes from a controlled excavation, with notes on its room, level, and associated objects, is like a page torn from a book where at least you know which chapter it belonged to. A tablet that appears on the art market with no find spot is closer to a random paragraph, in a language you only half understand, with no way to be sure whether it was originally part of history ritual or schoolwork. For the earliest periods, the proportion of tablets with secure archaeological context is relatively small. Many Uruk and Jemdet-Nasa pieces entered collections long before modern field methods. We can date them roughly by script style, clay fabric, and parallels, but that is not the same as knowing where in a city or in which building they were used. Then there are the lost languages, early Mesopotamian writing records, Sumerian, and, soon after, Akkadian, but there are hints of earlier or parallel tongues, substrate words that do not look Sumerian, place names that resist etymology, odd sequences of signs in proto-cuneiform that might be logograms for things we can name only in later languages. Scholars can sometimes see that a name or term does not fit, that it has been borrowed from something older. But if the donor language has left no independent texts, its sounds, grammar, and meanings are ghosts. We are reading quotes from a language whose own writing, if it ever existed, has vanished. And even when the language is known and the signs are legible, many texts were never designed to stand alone. Administrative tablets assume an office routine everyone shares. They do not explain what a particular ration category really looked like, or how you moved from one line in a list to the next in physical space. Ritual instructions might say, "Do as is customary," or skip steps that were obvious to any apprentice priest. Omen series reduce complex performances to compressed formulas. If the liver is thus, then that. The staging, the tone of voice, the questions people actually brought to these signs are left outside the clay. We can translate every word and still not know what it felt like or exactly how it worked. And all of these limits are moving targets. Our understanding of early writing is not a finished map. It is more like a weather report that keeps updating. Fragments that sat separately for a century suddenly join when someone notices that the traces of fibres on the back, or the pattern of seal impressions on the edge, line up. Photogrammetry and 3D scanning reveal faint wedges invisible in old photographs. Multispectral imaging pulls out erased lines or damaged signs. A sign thought to have one value in the Uruk period turns out, after a new join, to have been doing something different entirely. Each revision nudges whole translations. A word you once rendered as field might need to be orchard. A title might turn from priest to overseer, changing how we picture local power. A city name read in one way for decades can be resegmented into two words, dissolving a place that never really existed on the map. Chronology shift as well. Radiocarbon recalibrations, redatings of key strata, and new synchronisms with Egypt or Anatolia can move whole reigns and dynastic sequences by decades, sometimes more. When that happens, the early in earliest writing stretches or contracts. Tablets thought to be close to an origin point slide further down the line, and other more fragmentary pieces suddenly gain importance. So even the timeline we're translating against is under quiet, constant negotiation. Taken together, these layers of uncertainty mean that the before us world of the first writing is not just distant, it is open-ended by design. Clay breaks. Fires rearrange archives. Scribes copied selectively, saving what they thought mattered, discarding or repurposing what did not. Later compilers folded older traditions into new frameworks, editing as they went. Our own access is filtered again by what excavators happen to find, what could be safely removed, what ended up in collections that welcomed scholars, and what still sits undocumented. The archive is incomplete not just by accident, but by the way human beings have always handled information, piece by piece, with priorities, with losses. That might sound discouraging, but it's also why this world never quite closes. There will always be one more tablet in a storeroom whose hand matches a famous scribe. One more early sign whose real function only becomes clear when someone finally compares every occurrence in a new database. one more tiny join that turns two nonsense fragments into a coherent line about a king before the flood, or a shipment of fish to a temple that no longer exists. The mystery is not a wall, it is a horizon that moves as we walk, and so the work continues, slow, careful, often quiet. Lists become legible, myths acquire new shades of meaning, dates sharpen by a generation or two. But the earliest written world remains partly out of reach, not because we are failing, but because what survives was never the whole story. In a way, that is fitting. Those first scribes were already looking back themselves, writing about kings and floods and gifts of civilization that lay before their own memories. They too were translating a world that had already begun to slip away. As we leave them now and let the tablets rest, we can follow that feeling instead of fighting it. The sense that there is always something just behind the last readable line, some older city, some quieter voice, still there in the dark between the wedges. And from that darkness, from the edge of the first pages, we can say goodnight. So as you drift towards sleep, you can hold the oldest writing in your mind not as a solved puzzle, but as a doorway left slightly open. On one side is what we can say with some confidence, baked clay that really does record grain, sheep, silver, names of officials and gods, sign lists that show step by step how picture marks hardened into cuneiform, king lists that almost certainly remember real rulers, even if their reign lengths are stretched past the horizon of literal time, flood stories that share motifs with later traditions in nearby cultures, suggesting a deep pool of remembered disaster behind the myths. These are the parts where the wedges line up, the cross-checks hold, and different scholars, working independently, keep arriving in the same neighbourhood. On the other side is what remains debated, whether some proto-cuneiform signs are numbers, commodities, or something more abstract, whether certain before the flood kings are echoes of local chiefs stitched together into a single lineage, whether an Omen text is mostly practical observation dressed in symbolism, or mostly symbolic thought clothed in empirical language, whether a broken line in a hymn restores best as created mankind, or fashioned the black-headed people, changing how inclusive that origin moment might have felt. Here, interpretations are offered, defended, revised, sometimes quietly abandoned. Footnotes lengthen. New readings compete with old ones. The tablets themselves do not move, but their meanings do. And then there is what is still not read at all. Clay that has never been unwrapped from its packing. Tablets digitized but not yet studied. Scripts that show up on seal stones or short labels in early cities, related to cuneiform but not perfectly overlapping, as if parallel experiments in how to mark speech and number on matter, languages hinted at only by the way certain words refuse to break down into anything familiar. These are blank spaces with outlines, shadows without confirmed shapes. Standing in front of that open doorway, it is tempting to ask for a final answer anyway. A master key that would unlock all the sign values, all the metaphors, all the lives behind the wedge marks. But if you listen closely to the history of how we got here, from the first recognition that those little marks were script, through the slow decipherment of Sumerian and Akkadian, through each small correction and rereading, a different picture emerges. The power of these earliest texts is not that they close the past, but that they keep inviting better questions. What did it feel like to live in a city whose name you could now write? How did it change a temple and the people who served there when offerings moved from memory into columns of numbers? What did scribes in later ages think they were preserving when they copied lists of kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years? Did they believe every year, or were they already reading those spans as symbols of something too large for ordinary counting? And over all of this, a quieter question hovers. If some distant future could only see our world in fragments, half-burned hard drives, a few unreadable file formats, shards of plastic with logos, scraps of books in languages whose sounds had been forgotten. What stories would they tell about us? Would they think our calendars were cosmic diagrams instead of scheduling tools? Would a list of social media followers look like a roster of retainers? Would a power bill, dense with numbers and units, be mistaken for a ritual text ensuring the favour of invisible forces? Which parts of our own lives would become before the flood to them? Vague, expanded, wrapped in legend because the direct records had dissolved? Letting that question sit for a moment can make the oldest tablets feel less remote. We and those first scribes are doing versions of the same thing, trying to catch a moving world in fixed marks, knowing, somewhere underneath, that most of what matters will always stay just beyond the edge of the page. If this quiet journey through the first writing has helped you drift towards sleep, or simply given you a new way to think about those distant cities and their unread lines, you can help it continue. When you wake, or whenever you remember, you can like this video, leave a comment and subscribe if you'd like more slow walks through deep time and old texts. It makes a real difference for a small channel trying to bring careful history into the calm parts of your day. And if you feel like sharing, write in the comments where you're listening from. A city, a region, a country. Somewhere under night skies that, in their own way, watched over Uruk and its scribes as well. For now, though, you can let the questions dim and the clay cool. The tablets will still be there tomorrow. The doorway will still be open. The first pages will still be waiting, their wedges holding more than we can see, and less than was once there. From that threshold, from the edge of the first written world and the long silence before it, good night.